Hi, and welcome back to Focal Point on AFR Talk. Brian Fisher is my name. The program is Focal Point, the home of muscular Christianity on Conservative Talk Radio. The network is the American Family Radio Talk Network, AFR Talk. Delighted and honored to welcome back to our decision maker line someone who's been a guest on this program before, Hans von Spakovsky. He is a senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation and manager of the Civil Justice Reform Initiative there. Hans, welcome back to Focal Point with Brian Fisher.
Brian, well, thanks for having me.
Well, you bet. Now, I want to get to an article that you wrote that was posted on the Heritage Foundation website, which I highly recommend to our listeners. I'm on that website multiple times every day. It's central to the show prep that I do here. But before we jump into that, Hans, I want to talk about, just when you think that this Obamacare situation couldn't be any more of a flaming train wreck, I call this thing Chernobyl care because it's in total, complete meltdown. We hear today, according to the New York Times, that now there is the limit on consumer costs is being delayed, again, by executive fiat. One of the things that President Obama told us when he campaigned for this bill, we are going to put a limit on your out-of-pocket expenses. We're going to protect you from this. And now that limit, that cap on out-of-pocket expenses, has been completely set aside by the Obama administration for 2014. What's your reaction to that?
I tell you, it's just another sign of how they passed a super complicated law that they hadn't even read before it went through. And even the Obama administration cannot manage to implement its terrible, complicated provisions. And this is just another reason why this effort to try to defund it, Republicans ought to be supporting it.
You know, and it's interesting to me, Hans, because you look at President Obama, who fancies himself, he's the guy that's out there looking out for the little guy. He's going to protect the little guy. He's going to reduce health care costs for the little guy. And that every time he turns around, he's doing something for larger companies, removing the employer mandate for a year, doing something for big insurance companies, removing the cap on individual expenses for the course of the year, and leaving in place the individual mandate. And I think individuals are the little guy is starting to say, hey, President Obama, when are you going to do something for me?
Yeah, that's true. And look, even his own Solicitor General, when he was arguing that, remember, the Obamacare case for the Supreme Court, at one point the justices said, look, this really is one big interlocking piece. If we find one part of this unconstitutional, it's going to make it very difficult for the entire bill to work. And his own SG agreed, yes, that was true. And yet here we now have all these different parts that he's delaying because they simply can't get them implemented in time.
Well, one last question, Hans, before we get into the meat of your article. And we've got some GOP, some Republicans out there complaining about this. Rand Paul's on Fox News this morning complaining about this. For the president to take it upon himself to decide which parts of the law he is going to follow and uphold and implement, and which parts he is going to ignore, he's going to waive, he's going to set aside. To me, Hans, this is a violation of his oath of office, where he took an oath before Almighty God and said, I will see that the laws are faithfully executed. That's a part of his responsibility as the chief executive officer. This just seems to me to be unconscionable and unconstitutional at the same time.
Oh, no, I agree, and I think Rand Paul has it exactly right. Look, this is a sign of something we've seen throughout this administration, which is, and look, this is the Saul Alinsky method, which is you just ignore the law, and this president believes he can do whatever he wants and that he's not bound by any of the limitations in the Constitution or the federal laws passed by Congress.
Now, I want to turn our attention to the subject of your column, which can be found on the Heritage Foundation website, heritage.org. And it has to do with the bill that Ted Cruz and Mike Lee have put together. There's a companion version in the House. And they're selling this as a piece of legislation that would defund Obamacare. And we've got a petition I looked at this morning. It's got almost 300,000 signatures on it. I've signed it. I've encouraged everybody in our listening audience to sign it. I had Roger Wicker on this program, a senator from Mississippi, who signed it originally, and then he unsigned it, and I wanted to find out why. So I've been a supporter of this, but the response from Republicans is that, oh, this won't work. It doesn't work. It's not going to delay funding. You're being oversold. What you're being told that this can defund Obamacare is not true. But according to your analysis, Hans, and I have tremendous respect for your insight, your analysis, your expertise, this bill would, in fact, delay implementation of Obamacare. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, one of the things that these critics have mistakenly said is that, look, what's coming up is a discretionary spending bill, and you can't use that to stop mandatory spending. Mandatory spending is stuff from entitlement, Social Security, things like that. But look, that ignores the fact that, the Hyde Amendment, which has been attached every year to discretionary budget spending, has been used for 40 years to prevent funding by Medicaid for abortions. So that is a great example of how you can use this kind of bill to do it. And this bill that Cruz and Lee are pushing, it might not stop all of the funding for some provisions, for all the provisions of the bill, but in fact, it will stop just about everything. The only thing it might not be able to stop are things that have already been done. But as we know, 90% of this has not yet gotten implemented.
I was looking at the congressional research. I actually read that 11-page analysis that they did. And, of course, Senator Coburn, I think, is the one that's citing that as a reason to vote against this Ted Cruz bill. But I read through that thing very carefully, and it indicated there were three things that still have to be put together to implement Obamacare. You've got to build out these exchanges. Right. You've got to build this federal data hub, which is a huge threat to personal privacy. That's a topic for another day. And then you have to do all this community outreach. Those are three major components of this. And we know from what we've read that those things are a long way from being done. If all the funding to implement those things comes to a screeching halt on October 1, I don't see how this thing gets off the ground.
No, I think your analysis is exactly correct. And I think the analysis that, unfortunately, Senator Coburn, who normally is pretty good on many issues, I think he's just got it wrong on this. Look, what's really going on, Brian, is that many Republicans are afraid of the political cost of getting into a confrontation with the president, and if the government gets shut down.
Hans, let me interject here. Let me interject here, and I want you to finish your thought. But I saw or heard the debate between Mike Lee and Karl Rove on Sean Hannity's radio program yesterday, and it just hit me in the middle of this thing. Karl Rove's problem is that he is a scaredy cat. They live in absolute abject fear of what the Washington Post is going to say about them rather than living in fear of what their constituents are going to say. So anyway, finish your thought.
Well, in fact, the reason they're scared is because they believe that, remember back in 95 when Newt Gingrich ended up in a confrontation with Clinton, the government was shut down, and what was the confrontation over? It was over trying to get a balanced budget. And everybody thinks the Republicans were really hurt in the 96 election. Turns out that's a myth. If you actually look at the election results, Republicans did very well. They didn't pay a big political price. And in fact, what did they get? They got a balanced budget for the first time in decades. They stood on their principles, and they got something worthwhile. And
they got welfare reform. They picked They picked up 2 seats in the Senate. They did lose some House seats, but they retained control of the House, and everybody seems to forget that. Now, Hans, you indicate that there is this law called the AntiDeficiency Act, and this has been cited by some, but there are there are only 2 exceptions that are cited in this AntiDeficiency Act where funding can continue in the absence of any kind of appropriations. Explain that to us and how Obamacare doesn't qualify for those exceptions.
Yeah, what everybody is saying is if a government shutdown occurs, not that the Cruz bill gets passed, but there's a shutdown, that the president will keep implementing Obamacare. But the problem is there's this federal law, it's called the AntiDeficiency Act, and it makes it illegal for federal employees to spend money that has not been appropriated. And when a shutdown occurs, they can only spend money on functions that are necessary to preserve property and human life, basically. And that means there's tremendous limits on what the government can do in a government shutdown. And one thing they can't do, by the way, is they can't accept voluntary services. So if any of these liberal advocacy groups out there say, well, look, we'll step in, we'll do this, the government can't accept it. And, by the way, criminal penalties for federal employees who violates this.
And, that ADA bill says it's got to be emergencies involving safety of human life. So it's not just routine, ongoing federal business. There's got to be some imminent threat to life or property. And in that case, you may be able to take action. But certainly Obamacare would not qualify. In fact, I would say if there's any kind of threat to human life here, it's in Obamacare with these death panels. We're seeing that in Oregon now, where they are going to deny chemotherapy to people based on their age and their projected lifespan. So these death panels are already kicking into government-run health care. Well, one last question, Hans, as you look at all the stuff we're talking about, this removal of the cap and all of that, all of these unilateral fiat changes that the Obama administration is making, it would certainly seem to me that you put all this together, there's a pretty powerful reason to do everything we possibly can to derail Obamacare. And right now, it looks to me like the only thing in front of us that may have a chance of working is to defund Obamacare through the continuing resolution. Your comments?
No, I think that's right. Look, let's assume for just a second that the Republicans fully funded the government, including all the stuff that's been cut through the sequester, except for Obamacare, and then they give it to the Democrats and the president. That puts the president in the defensive position of having to say, well, I'm willing to shut down the government, even though all of it's being funded except for Obamacare, which a majority of Americans don't like and don't want to see implemented.
You know, and I don't understand, and this is the last thing I'll ask you to comment on, Hans. You know, when I hear Karl Rove, he's saying, well, look, yeah, you send it over to the president. He's just going to send, or you send it over to the Senate. The Senate's going to send it right back, and the ball's going to be right back in your court. Everybody's going to be blaming you again. This absolute fear, this abject fear of what the reaction is going to be among the media elites rather than among their own constituents. And it seems to me that the call is now for people that have the courage to step up and say, look, this is not about our political future. And besides, I just don't see the risk, Hans. This is the last thing I'll ask you to comment. I don't see the risk for the Republicans here. The more people find out about Obamacare, the more people don't like it, the more people want it repealed, want it modified. I just don't see how it's a loser for Republicans to oppose something that the majority of the American people don't like.
Well, frankly, I think your analysis is a heck of a lot better than many pundits in Washington.
Our guest has been Hans von Spakovsky. He is the senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation and manager of the Civil Justice Reform Initiative there. Hans, always a delight to have you on. Very informative, very educational. Appreciate the work that you and everybody at Heritage Foundation does. God bless you.
Well, thank you very much.
Hans von Spakovsky of the Heritage Foundation. That's an organization doing absolutely great work. I couldn't do show prep without the information provided by the Heritage Foundation. Focal Point AFR Talk, back with a special guest in 2 minutes. Don't go anywhere.